What if the strongest tool your body has against cancer isn't a drug, a surgery, or anything you get from a hospital, but something you do every single morning before you even eat? What if the habits you repeat before 9 a.m. are quietly shaping the internal conditions that certain cells depend on? Here's a number that tends to stop people. By the time men reach their 50s, about half of them already carry microscopic prostate cancer cells. For women between 40 and 50, it's roughly 40% with tiny cancer clusters in breast tissue. And by the time people reach their 70s, small cellular changes in tissues like the thyroid become increasingly common in population studies. But here's the part that matters. Most of those never grow. They don't spread, they don't turn into anything dangerous. Not because of luck, not because of medication, because of what your body's already doing to keep those cells contained, quiet, and cut off from what they need. So the real question isn't whether cancer cells exist. They almost certainly do. The real question is what kind of environment you're creating for them, especially in the first hours of your day. Are you creating conditions that make it easier for them to grow or conditions that keep them limited? Because these cells don't operate randomly. They depend on very specific conditions. Higher glucose, higher insulin, ongoing inflammation, poor circulation, and a system that isn't clearing out damaged cells efficiently. When that environment is in place, they have what they need to grow. When it's not, they stay small, they stay silent, and the shift between those two states often starts much earlier than people think, right around sleep and right when the day begins. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through 6 key insights that reshape how to look at mornings, metabolism, and your body's built-in defenses. We'll look at the process that clears damaged cells overnight, how insulin acts as a growth signal, which foods influence blood supply to tumors, and the simple morning sequence that researchers themselves have started to follow. Stay with me through the whole thing because insight number 5 is one of the most overlooked and one of the most actionable. And if this kind of biology, how your body actually manages risk day to day matters to you, subscribe now. Inside your body, there's a system most people never think about, but it's doing a lot more than it gets credit for. It's called angiogenesis. It's how your body builds and maintains blood vessels. Under normal conditions, it's what allows wounds to heal, what delivers oxygen to your heart, what supports a developing baby during pregnancy. In the right balance, it keeps you alive. But the same system is also what tumors rely on. Even the smallest cluster of abnormal cells can't grow, can't spread, can't turn into anything dangerous unless it can pull in a blood supply. That shift, when a tumor starts creating its own network of vessels, is what's known as pathological angiogenesis. Without that supply, those cells stay small. They stay inactive. A simple way to picture it, think of a weed sitting in dry soil. It's there, but it doesn't go anywhere. The moment it finds water, everything changes. That's when it takes off, starts expanding, starts pushing everything else out. What most people don't realize is that many of those microscopic cancer clusters already exist, but they're being held in that inactive state because they haven't accessed a blood supply yet. And that's not random. That's your body actively controlling the environment. There are over 100 naturally occurring compounds in everyday foods that have been shown to influence this process, specifically by limiting the kind of blood vessel growth tumors depend on. A lot of this work has been studied in depth by William Li, who has spent decades focused on how the body regulates this system. His research has reached millions, including a TED Talk viewed over 11 million times. And through the Angiogenesis Foundation, his work has contributed to more than 30 medical treatments across over 70 diseases. The pattern that shows up again and again is consistent. What you eat, how often you eat, and what your body is doing in the early hours of the day all feed directly into whether this system stays balanced or starts to tilt in the wrong direction. And after a certain point, that difference stops being theoretical. That same pattern shows up again when you look at how often the body shifts between a fed state and a fasted one. Every time you eat, insulin rises. That's expected It's how your body moves glucose out of the bloodstream and into cells. But insulin isn't just about blood sugar. It also acts as a growth signal. It tells cells to take in nutrients and expand. And in a body where abnormal cells are already present, which for most people over a certain age is very likely, that signal doesn't just apply to healthy tissue. A simple way to see it: picture those cells as seeds sitting in dry ground. They're there, but they're limited. Then insulin comes in, like rain. Some rain is necessary. But when it's constant, when it shows up again and again throughout the day, especially from frequent eating, sugar, refined carbohydrates, or late meals, it changes the entire environment. The conditions shift, and what was inactive starts to become viable. Research has been pointing in this direction for a while. A 2024 study in biomolecules showed that fasting, especially time-restricted eating, changes levels of glucose, insulin, glucagon, and IGF in ways that influence how cells behave. Follow-up work in 2025 found that intermittent fasting is associated with shifts in metabolic conditions that certain cells tend to rely on. And when you line that up with circadian research, a consistent window of about 12 to 14 hours without food, which for most people simply means finishing dinner around 7 or 8 in the evening and waiting until the next morning to eat again, aligns with the body's overnight repair cycle. That stretch, where insulin stays low and glucose remains stable, is when a different set of processes takes over. So instead of breaking that window early, holding it a little longer changes the signal the body is sending. If dinner ended at 7, waiting until around 9 the next morning keeps that fasting period close to 14 hours. It doesn't feel like much, but it shifts the environment, and that shift changes what those cells have access to. If this kind of detail, the way small daily timing decisions shape what's happening under the surface, is something you want more of, subscribe now. That same window you've been holding overnight creates a very specific internal state. Insulin is low, blood sugar is steady, and autophagy has been running. And the overall environment is about as stable as it gets. That's where everything is working in your favor, but in a matter of minutes, it can flip. A bowl of instant oatmeal with dried fruit, a glass of orange juice, a muffin on the way out the door, or even a smoothie that looks healthy but is loaded with fruit and added sweetness is often enough. Within 15 to 20 minutes, blood glucose rises sharply, insulin follows, inflammatory signals increase, and the state you just spent the entire night building starts to unwind. That shift isn't subtle because at a cellular level, those same conditions are exactly what certain cells respond to. Cancer cells, in particular, tend to rely heavily on glucose. That pattern has been known for nearly a century, often referred to as the Warburg effect, where these cells consume glucose at a much higher rate than normal tissue. It's the same principle used in modern imaging. In a PET scan, a form of labeled glucose is introduced into the body, and the areas that take it up most aggressively become visible. Those areas light up. So when glucose and insulin spike first thing in the morning, the signal being sent is very direct. Fuel is available, conditions are favorable, and the environment shifts in a way that moves away from what you had just established overnight. And the way that shift gets controlled comes down to what you do right at that first meal. Not whether you eat, but how you break that fast. Starting with protein and healthy fats changes the response almost immediately. Eggs, avocado, a handful of walnuts, smoked salmon, or plain Greek yogurt without added sugar, those kinds of foods don't push insulin up the same way. The rise is smaller, blood sugar stays more stable, and the environment that was in place overnight doesn't get disrupted in the same way. It holds. That difference carries forward. Instead of flipping into a high glucose, high insulin state, things stay more controlled, and the inflammatory signals that tend to follow a sharp spike are much lower. Even when fruit is included, the type and the pairing matter. Lower glycemic options, especially berries, behave differently. And when they're eaten alongside protein or fat, the glucose response is blunted, so the shift stays more gradual. That first input sets the direction because once insulin rises sharply, it doesn't just affect that moment, it influences what happens across the rest of the day. So the opening meal isn't just about calories or preference, it's setting the metabolic tone that everything else builds on. And when that foundation is in place, the next layer comes from specific compounds that interact with that same blood vessel system. One of the most studied examples is green tea. It contains a compound called EGCG, epigallocatechin gallate, which has been looked at across both laboratory and clinical settings. What shows up consistently is its effect on the growth of new blood vessels, particularly the kind that tumors try to form. It interferes with that process. It has been observed to interfere with pathways involved in the formation of new blood vessels, and this isn't based on a single data set. Multiple studies have observed that compounds in green tea are associated with changes in pathways involved in the development of cells in areas like the colon, liver, breast, and prostate. The timing matters here. When it's consumed early, before introducing a large amount of glucose into the system, it enters that environment while things are still stable. Nothing has been disrupted yet, which changes how those compounds interact with the body. That same pattern shows up again with foods that most people already have access to. Tomatoes are one of the clearest examples. They're rich in lycopene, a carotenoid that has been associated with anti-angiogenic activity. In a long-term study following more than 51,000 men, those with higher lycopene intake showed a meaningful reduction in prostate cancer risk compared to those with lower intake. What's often missed is how preparation changes the outcome. Cooking tomatoes increases how much lycopene the body can absorb, and even a short saute can raise that availability significantly. Adding a small amount of olive oil increases it further since lycopene is fat soluble. So, something as simple as eggs cooked with tomatoes and olive oil shifts from just being a meal to something that interacts with that same underlying system. There's also an effect that shows up when certain foods are combined. In some cases, pairing compounds increases their impact beyond what either one does on its own. For example, combining different types of tea, like Japanese sencha and Chinese jasmine, has been observed to produce a stronger anti-angiogenic response than either alone. And then there's coffee, not in the form most people are used to, but taken without added sugar or syrups. Its polyphenols, including chlorogenic acid, have been associated with improved insulin sensitivity and changes in how the body handles energy. In that context, it doesn't push the system in the same direction as high sugar options. It fits into the same pattern where the overall environment stays more controlled rather than being disrupted. This same pattern continues across different foods and combinations. Green tea is one of the clearest examples. It contains EGCG, a compound that has been studied for how it affects the formation of new blood vessels. What shows up repeatedly is its ability to interfere with that process, especially the kind tumors rely on. It limits how easily those vessels can form. And without that network, the cells that depend on it tend to remain more limited in how they expand. This has been observed across different types of cancer cells. Studies have reported associations between these compounds and changes in how cells behave in areas like the colon, the liver, the breast, and the prostate. So when it's introduced early, before the system has shifted out of that stable overnight state, it interacts with a very different internal environment. One where the conditions haven't already been pushed in the opposite direction. The same pattern continues when you look at how certain foods behave once they're prepared and combined. Tomatoes are a good example. They're one of the richest sources of lycopene, a compound that's been linked to how blood vessel growth is regulated. In a large follow-up study of more than 51,000 men, those who consumed higher amounts of lycopene showed a noticeable reduction in prostate cancer risk compared to those with lower intake. What changes the outcome isn't just the food itself, but how it's used. Cooking tomatoes increases how much lycopene your body can actually absorb, and even a short saute can raise that availability by up to 50%. Adding a small amount of olive oil increases it further, since lycopene dissolves in fat. So, something as simple as eggs cooked with tomatoes and olive oil ends up interacting with the system very differently than raw ingredients on their own. There's also an effect that shows up when certain combinations are used together. Some compounds amplify each other. In one example, pairing Japanese sencha with Chinese jasmine tea produced a stronger anti angiogenic effect than either one alone. And then there's coffee, not with added sugar or flavored syrups, but in its basic form. It contains polyphenols like chlorogenic acid, which have been associated with improved insulin sensitivity and changes in how the body processes energy. In that context, it doesn't push the system toward the same kind of spike. It fits into the same pattern where the environment stays more stable rather than shifting out of balance. And that same window you've been extending overnight is also when another process starts to come online. It doesn't happen right away. It begins to show up around 12 hours after your last meal. That process is called autophagy. It's often described as the body's internal cleanup system. What it does is go through cells and remove what's no longer functioning properly. Damaged proteins, dysfunctional mitochondria, cellular components that have accumulated errors over time. Those get identified, broken down, and either recycled or cleared out. And that includes early stage cellular changes that could move in a problematic direction if left alone. So it's not just maintenance, it's a form of surveillance built into the system. The mechanisms behind this were significant enough that Yoshinori Osumi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2016. That tells you how central this process is, but it only runs under certain conditions. It becomes active when the body is not processing incoming food, and it shuts down when eating resumes, especially when insulin rises. That switch is immediate. So the length of that overnight window determines how much time this process has to do its work. Research looking at time-restricted eating has shown measurable changes in autophagy-related activity over periods of 3 to 6 months, along with reported shifts in sleep quality, energy, and overall function, which lines up with what's happening underneath. So extending that fasting period into the morning, keeping it in that 13 to 14 hour range, allows that system to stay active longer. And when food does come in, starting with protein and fat, keeps that transition from shutting everything down too abruptly. That way, part of that environment carries forward instead of resetting all at once. And that same window, right after waking, is shaping a different set of signals at the same time. What most people do in that first stretch tends to move things in the opposite direction, reaching for the phone, scrolling, sitting still, taking in information that immediately triggers a stress response. Meanwhile, cortisol is already rising on its own. That's part of the natural rhythm. It's meant to help mobilize energy, to get you ready for the day. But when that rise is met with stress and no movement, it doesn't resolve the way it's supposed to. It stays elevated longer. And over time, that pattern is associated with reduced immune function, higher levels of inflammation, and a shift in the internal environment that moves away from stability. A small change in behavior shifts that movement. Even something as simple as a walk starts using glucose in muscle instead of leaving it circulating. A 20 to 30-minute walk outdoors does that while also exposing your body to natural light. That light signal feeds directly into your circadian rhythm, the internal timing system that regulates sleep, hormones, metabolism, and cellular repair. When that rhythm is disrupted, research has linked it to changes in how cells cycle, how DNA repair is handled, and how metabolism is regulated. And the opposite is also true. Early light exposure helps set that clock. It influences when melatonin is produced later in the day, which plays its own role in overnight processes. So the sequence that ties all of this together is straightforward. It starts with waking up without eating right away, followed by drinking water, getting outside, or at least exposing the eyes to natural light for a few minutes, and adding some movement, ideally a 20 to 30-minute walk, then something like black coffee or green tea. And only after that, once that overnight window has reached that 13 to 14 hour mark, you have your first meal. It's not complicated, but the order matters because each step feeds into the same underlying system. And when you step back and look at how all of this fits together, the pattern stays consistent. There's already a system in place that regulates blood supply, and that's what determines whether those small clusters stay contained or begin to expand. The overnight fast keeps insulin low and allows those internal cleanup processes to run. The way that fast is broken either maintains that state or reverses it. And the foods that come in, especially when they're combined in certain ways, interact directly with the same mechanisms that control how cells grow and how blood vessels form. At the same time, what happens in that first part of the day, movement, light, and how cortisol is handled, feeds into the body's internal timing system. And that system connects to sleep, hormone regulation, metabolism, and the way cells repair themselves over time. None of this depends on a prescription. It doesn't require a complex routine. It comes down to a set of small actions that repeat and over time shift the internal environment in one direction or the other. So instead of trying to change everything at once, narrowing it down to one adjustment is enough to start extending the overnight fast a little longer, replacing a high sugar drink with something like green tea, adding a short walk before the first meal, or changing that first meal itself. Any one of those begins to move the system. And over time, those small shifts add up. Not in a way that removes risk entirely, but in a way that changes the conditions those cells depend on. Parts of that internal environment are influenced by daily patterns that stay within your control. And it starts with what you do tomorrow morning. If this kind of biology, the way daily choices shape what's happening under the surface, is something you want to keep exploring, subscribe now.